Eh bien, je suis heureux de vous accueillir pour la conférence du professeur Jens Beckert, qui a été invité par l'Assemblée des professeurs du Collège de France à venir donner une conférence ici. Il la donnera en anglais, mais il prendra les questions que vous pourrez lui poser. Vous pourrez les poser en français ou en anglais ou en allemand, si vous voulez. Voilà, il est multilingue comme il se doit. Et professeur Beckert est directeur de l'Institut Max-Planck pour l'étude des sociétés de Cologne depuis 2005. Et c'est un des réseaux majeurs de la science internationale, comme vous savez. Il est membre aussi de l'Université de Cologne, du département Arts, Humanités, Management, Économie et Sciences sociales. Donc il est pluridisciplinaire, nous le savons. C'est un des sociologues allemands les plus réputés internationalement. Il est lauréat du prestigieux Leibniz Prize et membre de l'Academia Europea et du Berlin-Brandenburgische Akademie der Wissenschaften à Berlin. Et il est reconnu pour ses travaux de sociologie économique, sociologie des marchés, socio-économie des processus d'évaluation, sociologie des organisations, mais aussi sociologie des inégalités de revenus et de patrimoine. Et plus récemment, il a consacré des travaux qu'il va vous présenter aux enjeux climatiques. C'est l'objet de son dernier livre, How We Solved Our Future, publié par Polity Press en 2025, et qui constituera le socle, je crois, de sa conférence d'aujourd'hui. Il a aussi consacré une partie de son œuvre au renouvellement des paradigmes théoriques de la sociologie à partir de travaux sur la temporalité de l'action individuelle et collective et la capacité des sociétés à fonder en raison et en imagination les anticipations du futur. C'est l'objet d'un de ses livres les plus cités, Imagined Futures, Fictional Expectations and Capitalist Dynamics, publié à Harvard University Press. Il a publié aussi Beyond the Market, Social Foundation of Economic Efficiency, chez Princeton University Press, et puis Inherited Wealth, chez Princeton aussi, et il y a beaucoup d'autres. Je vais lui laisser tout de suite la parole.
Oui, bonjour et merci beaucoup pour cette invitation et votre présentation. Je suis désolé que je vais parler en anglais. Je n'ai simplement pas la confiance de donner cette conférence en français. Mais si vous voulez poser votre question en français, je crois que ça marche, mais probablement je vais répondre en anglais. So what I will do in the next 45 minutes or so is present parts of this book that, as Pierre-Michel Menger has just said, came out in English in 2025 and in German in a year earlier. And it is a book on climate change, obviously, and it's a book which is pessimistic with regard to the possibility to reach the Parisian climate goals or to get anywhere close to them. And of course, as we know, if temperatures rise substantially above this, which I think they will, and this is also a consensus in more or less a consensus in climate science, then there will be huge consequences for societies from this. Now, what I am discussing in this book is not the consequences from climate change, but the question that interests me is why do societies actually fail in addressing a problem that is so obvious to a general public, also within science? This is known since 100 years as a problem, but for a broader public, that is known since at least 40 years. And nevertheless, the development, if you look at the greenhouse gas emissions and the increase in greenhouse gas emissions that have taken place over those 40 years, you see that they are steadily increasing. So I would like to start by just presenting you some graphs, which in one way or the other you have probably seen before, to simply show the situation as it is. So these are global greenhouse gas emissions just from the burning of fossil fuels. Others are not included in this number here. But what's important is that that's now, since 1990, a continuous rise in greenhouse gas emissions, despite the efforts that are being made politically, economically, in public discourse to address this problem. So roughly, since 1990s, a little less, but roughly greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel burns have doubled in this time. And this is, in a way, here a diagram which continues this. So the first part of this is the same of what you just saw, with now at somewhat different figures because it's greenhouse gas emissions in general. But this is the graph which shows what would need to be done actually to reach the goal of climate neutrality in the year 2050 and to reach the Parisian climate goals. So a drastic reduction in the emission of greenhouse gases right now. And of course, it doesn't need much explanation to say that this is obviously not foreseeable and gonna happen. So this is the last of these charts that I want to show you. That's again more or less the same chart. Now it is on energy use and the prediction of energy use in principle, and it distinguishes here between renewable energy and fossil fuels. And what you see when you go here to this is roughly here where we are currently 2026. The assumption is here that there will be a peak in the burning of fossil fuels. And the assumption is also that there will be an increase in the production of renewable energy. But the assumption, and that is in accordance with the International Energy Organization here in Paris, agency here in Paris as well, that in the year 2050, about 80 to 85% of the fossil fuels that are currently burned annually will still be burned. So far away from anything like climate neutrality. And this is the starting point of the that's the assessment that I think one has to realistically make, at least from what one knows today. Now it also holds, of course, that things are being done with regard to climate change and to the energy transition. And I would say that there was a time period roughly between 2015, the Paris Climate Accord, and 2022, the beginning of the Russian war in Ukraine, where one could get the impression that really something is shifting relatively fast. And even if it's not climate neutrality in 2050, things are happening. But since about 2022, and the Ukrainian war is important as a tipping point in this, we see dramatic incidences of backlash with regard to measures taken for the energy transition. And of course, that is something that we can read every day in the papers or here in the news. So think of the United States, and it is not happening just with the new president, Trump, who brought this, of course, to the extremes, but already under the former President Biden, oil production in the United States was expanded. So, but President Trump, he left the Paris Climate Accord. He has, and that's new, an active policy against renewables, and of course wants to ever increase American fossil fuel production. In Europe, the situation is slightly different, but also in Europe, there is a backlash against climate goals that were set, And one can see this in debates in the European Union. Yeah, combustion engine cars, should they be outlawed by 2035? I mean, the new cars, combustion engine cars, yeah, or should this be further postponed? So there are all kinds of political measures, yeah, where the actual change with regard to an energy transition is postponed. The same one can see in the financial sectors, where these investments in environmental, social, and governance investments that are conscious of environmental impact of financial investments are declining since a couple of years again, where the important alliance of financial institutions, the Net Zero Banking Alliance, was dissolved at the beginning of last year. And we see this, of course, also politically. And Germany is a very good example for this, where climate policy actually became more and more a political liability for politicians. So it is unattractive. You cannot win elections with climate policy. Now, I also want to say, and I talk at the end of my lecture a little bit about this in more detail, that there's one country, yeah, which is very interesting, that is China. But it is contradictory what is happening in China. On the one hand, it is the country by far that is expanding renewable energies, and a substantial part of Chinese energy is now renewable. But it also, yeah, as a country that grows fast, it increases the fossil energy consumption. Now, if this holds, then we will see increasingly severe and frequent climate events in the future. And here you see, in this table, you see assessments of climate science in United Nations climate scientists, where they see, yeah, at the end of the century, the average temperature increase. And you see that 3/4 of them see them beyond 2.5%. Yeah? Now, they also cannot look into the future, but there you see that what I'm saying here with regard to these assessments, it is not just born out of my mind. Now, the main question that I'm asking is, why are societies seemingly incapable to stop climate change, to have the measures which would actually change the situation? And the book has a very clear answer to this, which is then spelled out, and this is what I want to show to you also in this presentation, namely the argument that the fight against climate change is failing due to power and incentive structures in the economy, in the political realm, but also in civil society and us as citizens. And so we come to a situation where, despite the knowledge, yeah, which is widespread, not the appropriate measures are not being taken. And so the argument that I'm making in the book is a structural argument. Yeah, I'm not arguing that we are in the situation because there is a moral failure. Yeah, we are not, careful enough with our consumption. I mean, that is all true, but the book is interested in the question of why this is actually the case, and not attributing it to the moral failure of individuals, but attributing it to structures. And before I go into this in detail, I want to open a broader picture, yeah, at the beginning. Namely, I situate these structural conditions within the large social structures that have developed over the last 500 years, yeah, what I call capitalist modernity. You could also talk of the development of modern capitalism. And what's important to me in this is that this consists of at least two important, or two elements. One is economic change, yeah, the changing economic structures where economies are organized increasingly around markets and competition. And by being organized around markets and competition, economies are brought on a growth path. Yeah? They have an imperative, a capitalist economy, to continuously grow. And this is supported also, of course, historically by the increase of private property through enclosure movements historically, but these elements of commodification, you could also say, something that is going on all along. What has happened is an increasing expansion of this system, which at the beginning was in rather small pockets, but today, especially with the development of China, is basically in all parts of the world as the dominant economic paradigm. This only was possible in context of technological and scientific developments since the 16th, 17th century. But what's important for me, more so than the technological side, is that these economic changes are accompanied also by cultural changes, which are important to understand also the reactions to issues of climate change. One is that societies get oriented towards a notion of progress, yeah, and thereby towards a future orientation. And that is not to be taken for granted. For most parts of history, traditional societies are societies that live in the present and imagine the future also as a repetition of the circumstances and situations that they know from the present. But with the Enlightenment especially, we have an understanding that societies are progressing, that they are developing, that the future is different from the present and from the past. And that's a very important temporal reorientation, cultural reorientation in the temporal order of societies. Then secondly, an emphasis on values of individual freedom over collective norms. And thirdly, an understanding of nature, where nature is not seen as part of us and part of it, but as a duality, as something that is external, yeah, to us. And that is something that is also not to be taken for granted, but something that is historically evolved. Also, the Enlightenment plays an important role in it, yeah, but where nature is seen as an object. In contrast to this, we have also societies, animistic society, where nature is seen as part of the cosmology of humans. Yeah? You are kin of nature. And thereby, you have different obligations with regard to safeguarding also nature and protecting your natural environment in which you live. Now, these changes have led, and I think that is important to emphasize, to an unparalleled wealth development. Yeah? It's not here, but I could have shown you a graph. If you look at wealth development over long historical periods, the last 2,000 years, you see stagnation for more or less stagnation for the first 1,800 years, and then roughly in the year 1800, the curve is going steeply up. Yeah? And of course, I mean, the advantage this has brought to us is very clear, yeah, and I don't think that anybody wants to turn back the clock with regard to this, but the price through which this became possible was the dramatic expansion of the use of fossil fuels. Yeah? Societies stay poor as long as they don't have energy. They become rich only with the use of energy, and fossil fuel, of course, is standing behind the burning of fossil fuels is standing behind greenhouse gas emissions. So in the book, I develop a very simple sociological model of social differentiation, where I distinguish between the economy and companies, the state and politics, and what I call here population, could also be society. It's difficult to find the right word here, but what I mean is citizens and consumers here. And I look for these three spheres. What are the incentive structures of actors in these spheres? And can we explain through these incentive structures what we are actually observing? Now, these three realms, they stand in a relationship of interdependence also, which is important, also in a relationship of conflict. But at the end, the argument is that all these three spheres come together in externalizing the environmental consequences of the preferences that are and action orientations that are dominant in these spheres. So I want to show this now briefly for these three spheres, and I start with the economy or companies. And here the argument is a very simple one. In a capitalist economy, companies are profit-oriented. And if you just take the energy industry, which is one of the largest industries in the world, an industry which has over the last 50 years an average profit of $1 trillion. So it's also one of the most profitable industries in the world. Now, in the operation of this industry, the consequences on the natural environment from the burning of fossil fuels, from the production burning of fossil fuels, are externalized. So they are not part of the budget sheet of the companies. And as long as this is not the case, it's not part of the cost structure, companies have an incentive to simply destroy the environment whenever that appears profitable in the calculations. Now, that means also that these very successful business models, not only in the fossil fuel industry, but also in the industries that are then attached to it, like the car industry, that these profits are defended. And there is a 50-year history, at least, of exercising structural and instrumental power of this instrument, of this industry, through strategies of denial, through strategies of delay, through strategies of individualization, to disperse criticism and opposition to this externalization of nature. And so you may know that the carbon footprint measure, which is, very popular, was at least for a time very popular, where you could even on your smartphone type in what is my carbon footprint. This was an instrument that was popularized by one of the multinational oil companies with a purpose to individualize responsibility for what is happening with regard to climate change, and thereby disperse responsibility from the company. I want to give you one additional example for the operation of the logic of the economic system, which I found incredibly impressive when I was writing the book. And that refers to a referendum that was held in Ecuador in 2023, where the Ecuadorian people were asked whether they agree that one oil field in a national park should be closed, so that no oil production takes place there anymore. And that was partly for environmental reasons, and partly it was also as a protection of the indigenous population from the consequences of the oil production. And so from surveys, one knew that this referendum would go through. In a few days before this referendum, one of the rating agencies, Fitch, downgraded the debt of Ecuador, the country debt of Ecuador, which means for the country that the debt servicing becomes more expensive. Now, from an economic rationale, that is completely understandable. If Ecuador has less income from oil, it will be in a worse position to serve its debt, and therefore the country risk of Ecuador goes up. But you see from the systemic logics here how this works against the possibility of actually doing something that would actually be helpful for fighting climate change, namely leaving the oil in the soil and not extracting it. Now, it's not that the transformation in the economy is not taking place at all. It is taking place to some extent, but it is taking place for sure too slowly. And here it is not just the economic incentives which are responsible, or the profit incentives which are responsible, but I think as a sociologist at least, one needs to be very much aware of what is called in sociology path dependencies or routines or trajectories. Now these are huge industries which have investments that have long-term investment horizons, where also people working in these fields are invested with their human capital in specific technologies. So these are complex social systems that we are talking about here. And one cannot expect simply that such complex systems can be changed from one day to the other. It's an organizational reason of why we see things moving slowly. What we see, I think, is what could be called a market struggle between different industries, carbonized industries and decarbonizing industries. And there's also power in the renewable energy sector now. And so it will be seen in the future which of these two sides will actually succeed. But now, also with the political help, what I talked about at the beginning, it seems that the fossil fuel industries and the industries associated with it have the power to at least prolong the period in which fossil fuels will still be massively used. Now, the second part of sphere that I discuss in the book is state and politics. And here you would expect, okay, this is now the field where the counterpower is. I mean, politics is responsible for the collective good and needs to protect its citizens by making sure that the environment is not destroyed. But what you see is, so to speak, compromises that are made in the political sphere. And that can also be explained by the incentive structures. So any state depends on tax revenues, and tax revenues depend on a prospering economy. So you cannot just close down industries because they are environmentally damaging. The same holds true also for the interest of the state in the income that workers in these industries have. Yeah? That, again, it has something to do with taxation, but of course it also has to do with mass loyalty. Yeah? If the economic situation gets worse, people get dissatisfied and protest against the government. So we see these compromises where it would be wrong to say nothing happens. There is environmental protection, but things are happening too slow. And another aspect has to do with the operation of the political system itself, at least in democracies, namely that there is a short-term orientation. There are very few incentives for politicians to put short-term burdens on voters in order to have long-term benefits. The benefits, the politicians who make the decisions and carry the cost, so to speak, politically for this, the benefits will come in at a time when they are a long time out of office. And that is an incentive structure which is unattractive, yeah, for doing something in this to protect the environment. And again, also for the state, it holds, and I don't go into this in detail, that we have a very complex transformation process with huge infrastructures. We have complicated political structures in this, which also, I mean, lead to these slow movements. Now, the last aspect or last social sphere realm that I'm talking about is the realm of consumption. And here the starting point is that one needs to understand the central role of economic prosperity and consumption for the integration of our societies. So the class conflicts that were so dominant in the first part of the 20th century and led to the political turmoil that affected, Europe, America, the whole world at the end. These class conflicts were pacified in the post-war period through a high level of growth, which allowed to distribute additional wealth broadly in the population. This is the time when broad spectrum of the population gain access to what we would describe today middle-class living standards. So that we have housing with heating, a car, we can go on vacation, all these, whatever, there's a refrigerator in the apartment, all these things. And we cannot underestimate how important this broadening of wealth in our society is for the integration, for the pacification of class conflicts in a society. So that means also, we cannot simply say we go into a degrowth and take substantial parts of this away. That would lead to distributional conflicts, which probably no political order could survive. Now, a second point, and that is associated with the cultural changes that I talked about at the beginning, is that consumption is seen increasingly as an expression of individual freedom. So this notion in economics of consumer sovereignty, which came into the 1930s, where when I, as an economics student, learned this, thought, what is this? Consumer sovereignty. There's all this advertising, etc. So it's the companies that determine, what we actually want. But I think there is something missing in such an interpretation. In our society, where a lot of our lives is determined through constraints in the workplace, in the family, etc., consumption is seen as the realm where we express our freedom in an unrestrained way on the marketplace. And that explains why reactions when political restraints on these freedoms are made, why the political reactions are so strong to this. And thirdly, as consumers, we define, or as people, we define our identity today very much in terms of the consumption level that we have in relation to others. So the competition, we observe in our proximity, what are our neighbors, what is the car that our neighbor is driving, where do they go on vacation, why can I not afford this? And so there is a competition for social status, which takes place through consumption, and which determines then our social status in society. And that is a competition which is endless. And I write in the book one sentence, that ends with yachts that are 100 meters long and have greenhouse gas emissions of 10,000 tons annually. There is no, you see, what I want to say is there is no built-in limit to this. It's a competitive process which can go higher and higher and higher. Now, what I'm arguing here is that it's not the individual failure, moral failure of the individual to live the way we live, but I want to understand the social structures in which our lives take place and make them the explaining factors for what we are seeing in terms of non-reaction. And there, another aspect that needs to be taken into account as well is, of course, the infrastructures in which we live. So the way we live, whatever we are living in the suburbs, people live in the countryside, others in the cities. The houses were built 100 years ago with certain energy standards. These are simply infrastructures in which our life takes place and where we cannot say, okay, they don't count for us anymore. If you live in the countryside, you need a car, even if you think that having a car is actually bad for the environment. When you're here in Paris and you look for an apartment, then you are happy to find an apartment, and you cannot say, because this has the energy standard, whatever, D or E or F, yeah, I do not take this apartment. Yeah, the housing stock is old. Most apartments are not environmentally, have high energy consumption. And these infrastructures that in which we live, they are important for understanding the consumer reaction to this, or non-reaction to this. Now, one word about the global dimension in this. If you look at just the data for the European Union and part also for the United States, you see a partial decoupling of economic growth from greenhouse gas emissions. But if you look at the global level, then you see what I showed at the beginning also, an ever-increasing emissions from greenhouse gases. And that has to do with the fact that European economies are not growing much anymore. There's also, over the last 30 years, a process of deindustrialization. But of course, some of the most populous economies and countries in the world, China over the last 3 decades, and now India, are growing. And so their energy consumption is increasing. And it depends, in my opinion, for the future of climate change, crucially, on the question whether a country like India will develop its economic growth based on renewable energies or on fossil fuels. Yeah, that is, and in 50 years down the road, the same question will be with regard to African countries. And I think it is open. What will be the outcome? Yeah, I can right now imagine both, but certainly also countries like India, yeah, they do invest in renewable energy, but they are also expanding, like what I said to China, expanding also their fossil fuel extraction. And then it is, given the need for development in countries in the global south, it is also the interest in exploiting the natural resources, not just energy, yeah, but also when it comes to renewable energy, lithium, for instance, and that has consequences then also for environmental damages that are produced by this. So when one follows these debates, then one side of the argument is, okay, this is all true, but the future is a form of green capitalism or green growth. And that means no problem with growth and expansion of economic activity. We can do this in a way through energy transition. We can do this in a way that actually we decarbonize the economy at the same time. So no contradiction between the two. Yeah? And in parts also, what I just said with regard to the European Union, partly the United States also, that is true. But then what stops me in believing in this argument are two things. One is this process takes way too long, given the consequences that are and the irreversibility that comes with climate change. And secondly, a growing economy, even if it is not based on fossil energies, is an economy that has an ever larger impact on our environmental resources. And that you can see a little bit here. This is here a chart which shows how the material use in not only energy, but in total, yeah, how this is ever increasing. And you have this in the public debate. In these statements, we would actually need 2 Earth to have the activities that we are having. Yeah, it is simply an overburdening of what we have as natural resources, and And so even if the argument is, even if the climate transition to renewable energy is successful, the environmental crisis consists of many other elements. Yeah? For instance, species diversity, pollution, water pollution, and to have a sustainable economy would mean that also these crises would be addressed. And that I personally cannot imagine that this can be done with an ever-increasing, expanding level of economic activity. So the logical consequence of this would be indeed to demand that the activities that we have, through which we engage with nature, are reduced. But then the paradox emerging here is exactly what I was saying, namely that the integration of our societies depends exactly on the expansion of the economy. And the working of a capitalist economy depends on its expansion. And of course, if we think of countries in the global south, I mean, who are stricken by poverty, there is no moral basis from which we could argue that they should not develop and alleviate poverty in their countries. So you see, you have all kinds of dilemmas that are developing here, which make it, I mean, a likely scenario that we are just getting more and more into a world in which we are confronted with environmental destruction. So if this is the case, then this implies that climate change is not just an ecological crisis, but it is actually a crisis of the social structures in which we are living, in the sense that these are structures which seem to be not capable to respond to an urgent problem on which our long-term survival on this planet or well-being on this planet depends. Now, one way to think about this sociologically has been proposed by German sociology Uwe Schimmank, who expands a well-known distinction from sociology by a third element. The well-known distinction in sociology comes from the 1960s, is the distinction between systems integration and social integration, something that all societies have to achieve. Systems integration is simply the functioning of the economy or of the state, etc. And then social integration refers much more to the moral foundations and cultural foundations, the life worlds of people. So we are not economies, we are not just systems. There's this element of moral economy as well. And those two have to come together. In the 20th century, the second part of the 20th century, we can understand as exactly this, for instance, through the welfare state. The welfare state is something where moral concerns in a society are integrated into a capitalist economy. But these compromises that were found there were all compromises at the cost of nature and the environment. That is where the agreement was always possible. Now, the task at hand is to integrate into this what Uwe Schimmank describes as ecological integration, namely that nature cannot just be taken for granted anymore as a resource that can be used, but that it so to speak, I mean, has impacts into the systems integration and into the social integration. And that means at the end that the externalization of costs that is so characteristic for the economy of today needs to change, and these externalized costs need to be reintegrated. But how this is being done, nobody has really, I believe, a convincing answer for. So what does this mean for the future? at the end, the last two slides that I want to show. And I believe one of the consequences is that societies, if temperatures rise in the predicted way, will be confronted in a dramatic way with losses and threats to assets that one can see already today. The annual damages from climate change are estimated at $1.4 trillion on a global level. That is more than 1% of the global national product. And with increasing temperatures, the expectation, of course, is that this is also increasing. And that means if the consequences of a warming planet are felt in our cities, in coastal regions, in regions which are then affected by drought or by flooding, then societies need to put a lot of emphasis on how to adapt to this, how to protect its populations from the consequences of climate change. And that has to do with physical infrastructures. Also here in Paris, of course, that is a big topic, to protect the city from heat in the summer, for instance, greening the city. You could also, France had episodes in the early 2000s from heat waves where I believe tens of thousands of people died prematurely. So an adaptation measure to this is the availability of air conditioning, of cooling, public cooling rooms, whatever you have. But societies will be forced to take more serious the question of how to protect the population from these consequences from climate change. And for me, this is not just a question of physical infrastructures. It's also a question of social infrastructures. If a society is increasingly confronted by losses from natural events, then you can imagine that conflicts over who is covering for these losses, who is exposed to these losses, who can escape from these losses, that these kinds of conflicts will play an increasingly dominant role in our societies. And how to avoid this from becoming processes of social disintegration. And then the last point is, of course, that even if a focus is on climate adaptation in these different forms, I think societies have no other choice but to address the issue of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, so climate mitigation as a topic. And here, for me, the question is where I think social scientists can contribute quite a bit. What are actually the conditions under which climate policies become more successful? They become politically easier to push through. And what are the conditions under which resistances against climate policies are reduced? And there is in the social sciences also quite a bit of work of this. For the companies and the economy, I think it clearly means it will only happen in companies if there are economic incentives, that you may like or you may not like, but that is how simply the system is operating. For politics, it means there need to be support coalitions and need to be built, so that politicians don't become punished in election day for environmentally friendly policies. And there are issues that are known. Some of it has to do with the protection of groups. So, for instance, or the participation in benefits. So in Germany, for instance, it is social scientists find, and that's very obvious, the resistance against these windmills, wind power, is immediately decreasing when the local population is participating in the benefits of it. And if this is not just an investor who is sitting God knows where. Yeah, and so I think through smart policies, something can be done better than it has been done so far. And then I want to just mention one last point, which plays no role in the book, because the book was written 2 years ago or 2.5 years ago, but which is, I think, right now absolutely on the foreground, namely that environmental policies become part of a geopolitical confrontation. And one part of this is that the Paris Climate Accord was possible when international cooperation, especially between the US and China, was still relatively okay. The Paris Climate Accord would have no chance to be agreed upon today in a situation where the international cooperation has deteriorated, as we know from, just turning on the TV. And so what is discussed here as a possibility is that there will be actually a split in the world along the pursued energy policies. And the distinction that is being made is that between petro-states and green states. One can imagine that while the United States, obviously with this president, is one of those petro-states where the fossil fuel energy is used as an instrument of power, that China is choosing, and other countries, choosing renewable energies, but also using them for strategic purposes in international relations. China is the #1 producer of solar panels. It's more than 90% of the equipment which comes to China. The advantage of Chinese factories there is so big by now that it is impossible for other countries to actually imitate this and invest in this. But if a country, and especially countries in the global south, some of them decide for this now, decide for renewable energies, it means a strategic dependency on China. But as part of such a geopolitical game, there is the possibility that at least parts of the world have a very fast transition to renewables. And if you talk about the global south, then it would leapfrog actually the fossil fuel, because many of these countries have very low energy provisions. So this is where I leave you, and I'm looking forward to a lively discussion.